Okay, so welcome to the Shir in Sfas Emes again in Kilat Chaverim here in Yerushalayim. Parshas Devarim, we have Moshe Rabeinu explaining the Torah to Am Yisrael. It says, Be'er Moshe, the Moshe Rabeinu explained the Torah, and Rashi says this means that he explained it in Shivim Lashon, in 70 languages. Okay, now again, the question is found in a few places. The Shem Shmuel asked, why? Why speak to Am Yisrael in 70 languages? They probably didn't understand at least 68 of them. So they probably knew Lashon HaKodesh and maybe Egyptian. What is the point of it? Now the Medrash, and it's a long Medrash, we're just going to talk about the clips of it that the Sfas Emes is going to be working with. It starts off with a pasuk in Mishlei, Marpe Loshon Eitz Chaim. Okay, and this means that the Eitz Chaim, which is the Torah, and we'll have to see why particularly that image of the Torah, that tree of life, Marpe Loshon heals the tongue. Okay, now again, tongue, Loshon has a multiple meaning. It can mean tongue, it can mean language. In English as well, we speak about that idea of many tongues, someone who can speak many tongues. So, what is it doing? The Medrash says, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ra'a l'shona shel Torah, machaviva shemarapa es haloshon. Hashem saw that the Lashon of Torah is so precious because, or he said, see that the Lashon of Torah is so precious because it can heal the Lashon. Okay, and that's what the Pasuk says. Now, some Mefarshim on the Medrash take that literally, meaning it can heal your mouth, right, or such. But here, and that refers to maybe Moshe Rabeinu, who was cured of his stuttering, of being a kvad peh. But now he says, L'shona shel Torah matir es haloshon. It also says that the Lashon of the Torah, the language of the Torah, permits languages. Okay, and then the Medrash goes on, but we're going to try to take a look at what this idea is that the Torah permits or makes allowable other Lashonos. So the Sfas Emes explains, he says, V'chiyus hakol min haTorah, meaning the underlying operating system of the world, of the universe, is the Torah. Now therefore, he says, the Torah is matir, it permits, or we'll see the word matir also can mean to like release or untie, like matir asurim, right? Someone who releases prisoners, to be matir a kesher on Shabbos, to untie a knot. He says, Shilashonos ha'umos rechokos me'akadusha. He says the languages of the nations are very far from kedusha, from holiness, umizgashmim, and they also have the property that they make you more physical, more material, when you utilize them, when you speak them. Okay, so already here we're starting to look at this question of how a language influences the person who speaks in the language. Right? There's a famous word to the Bali Musar, when Yaakov Avinu was dressed up as Esav to get the brachos from Yitzchak. So he dressed up, he wore these goat skins, but then he blew it, so to speak, when he spoke. Right, the way he spoke wasn't right, and Yitzchak Avinu said, "Wait a second, Hakol Kol Yaakov Vayadayim Yidei Esav." So they ask, Yaakov Avinu must have been much more intelligent than us, right? Once he was doing it, right, couldn't he know not to blow his cover by the speaking? So the answer was, you can dress up like Esav, but if you speak like someone, you are them. The language that you use is so powerful. He just wouldn't cross that red line. I can't speak like Esav. If I do, I'll no longer be Yaakov. So we'll be looking at this interaction of language. Now, the Shem Shmuel, they both spoke about this, quoting the Chidush Yarim, Sfas Emes' grandfather, the first Ger Rebbe. The Shem Shmuel, the second Zachajav Rebbe, was also a Talmud. And he says, no insult meant to the French. He says it's known that the language of French is something that can lead people to adultery and immorality. Right? Now again, the world says that French is a very romantic language, right? But basically they're both talking about the same thing. There's a famous, I've heard it in the name of the Chazon Ish, I haven't seen it inside, that he said, what the world calls love, we call chorus. Meaning many things that the world calls love are things which are forbidden. So French being the language of love, to us would be the language of many things which are forbidden. Okay, now he says a fascinating thing. He says, I believe, okay, and the Sfas Emes also in his Likutim says something similar. He says that it's because the nation is so enveloped in that way of life, therefore that influenced and formed the nature of their language. And therefore the language has that property, and then it can influence others who use it, okay, in those ways. It's a fascinating interaction of it. Later, right, both the Sfas Emes and the Likutim brings something similar, and he adds in something beautiful. He says, again, quoting the Chidush Harim, that the language, right, leads to immorality. He says, however, L'shono shel Torah mahafeches hara shebeloshon ahi l'tov. Torah has the power to transform the negativity that's in that language to good. Now he's starting to refer to this idea of marpe loshon, the healing language being Lashon HaKodesh, right? That it's matir Lashonos, that somehow it kashers, if you want to call it, other languages. He says, why? The Torah needs these 70 languages. The Torah's mission is going to be applied throughout the world and throughout history. And he says, sometimes the Torah needs those languages, lahaspir ba es hashomea. The Torah is going to have to reach people who aren't fluent in Lashon HaKodesh, or maybe people even if they can read Hebrew, but their primary language and their primary culture is another language. So he says, Nesta haloshan ahi mechuberes latohar. So he says there's a power of the Torah, and as it's expressed in Lashon HaKodesh, to connect that language, even French, to Tahara. And he says, V'nidche hara mikirba, and then that which is negative, which is bad inside of it, is expelled. V'nichneses ba ruach tahara, and a spirit of purity enters it. He said that is refuas haloshan. That is the idea of the healing of a language. If you have a language that's sick, the Torah and Kedusha have the ability to heal it. And here's his beautiful application. Rashi, throughout his Pirush in the Chumash, in the Gemara, will explain something, and then he'll give us a word, such and such, bila'az, right, which is the language of Ovdei Avodah Zarah, which in his milieu was French, like the word milieu, right? So he says, it's hard to believe, he said, that Rashi said, Lo yitochen sh'Rashi lo motza milin b'loshen HaKodesh lahasbir b'as HaKoreh. He doesn't believe that Rashi was like stuck, I can't get this across to people. In other words, anyone who's learned this, we realize he just uses one word. He doesn't really give a whole explanation in French. Just when he wants to compare it to something, he'll throw that one word. So he says he feels that he did it b'kavana. The tovas haklal. He said for the benefit of all those hamadabrim b'lashon. He wanted all those from his time on who spoke French, that Rashi would transform and influence French. Shetia refuah k'tzas l'lashon. French after Rashi is not the same as French before Rashi. He fixed it some. He says, "Yitachin shekodem shotzer Rashi ka'choisa loshon musheches od yosel hara." He said it's true. The Chidush Harim was talking in the 1800s when he said that French was a very negative language. But he says we have no idea what it was like before Rashi. So it could have been even worse. So now we understand why Moshe Rabeinu explained the Torah in 70 languages. This was a spiritual event. Its point wasn't to explain to the Jewish people or to do this kind of, what's it called, Berlitz, right, to try to give them all these different languages. He says that the point was, L'tam zeh b'yom Moshe Rabeinu Torah b'shivim lashon, af shelo haya medaber el Yisrael. He was only speaking to Am Yisrael who spoke Lashon HaKodesh, he said, or maybe Svat HaMitzrim, only the Egyptian. But nonetheless, he says, they certainly didn't need all 70. This created a connection of the Torah and Kedusha to all languages in the world. This was for the benefit of all generations who would come. For us, for everyone who's speaking every language. Or he said, Shetzofa sha'asidim legalos bein shivim humas. And he said it could be that Moshe Rabeinu was able to foretell that the Jews would be scattered in the world among the 70 nations. And there are going to be Jews who will be functioning in other languages. And therefore, there's the ability to remain connected to Torah, even though that language and the culture that that language brings is something very powerful. But that is what it's able to do. Now, the Sfas Emes also says that there is a positive in each of the 70 languages, meaning, Pirush sheyesh l'chol hashivim l'shonos derech miyuchad b'Torah ech l'nahig sham al pi pekudei haTorah. He especially explains Parshas Devarim is really viewed as the beginning of Torah Sheba'al Peh, which is the application of Torah to the day-to-day life situations that we find ourselves in all the different places. So he says each of the 70 languages represent a particular way that the Torah, so to speak, applies itself to the world. It applies itself to Italy and to France and to Poland and to Argentina. And really when it says that the Jews would be scattered in Arba Kanfos Haaretz, right, this really happened. I remember hearing Rav Moshe Shapiro Zatzal saying that he's met Jews. He met a Jew from Alaska, and he met a Jew from Tierra del Fuego in Argentina, meaning from like the highest inhabitable point on the world and the lowest inhabitable point on the world, and we're found all in between also. So he says it's not just something that we have to fight, that we have to resist. We have to know how to express Torah in that setting and in that culture. There is such a Torah. Maybe this echoes Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky's famous Perush. What was Yaakov Avinu learning in the yeshiva of Shem Be'ever? What did he have to learn there that he didn't learn, right, in Yitzchak Avinu's house, that he didn't learn from his grandfather Avraham Avinu? So he said that Shem Be'ever lived in a time of the flood, of great wickedness in the world, and now he was going to be traveling to the world of Lavan. He had to learn the Torah of that type of place. There's the Torah of that place. There's the Torah of knowing. So he says that's what's represented with each language. Now in the footnotes here, they quote a document which is known as the Kotzker Kvittel. I have to find out the history of this document. And it says there in the name of the Chidush Harim, right, again, right, asking why this was needed to be done. And here he asked it from a different twist. Not that Am Yisrael didn't understand the Shivim Lashon. He says, we remember the Medrash that the nations all had the opportunity to receive the Torah and yet refused, meaning, as explained, that internally it was not a fit for them. It wasn't a match. So why bother explaining it in their languages? They were out of the Torah. He says, nonetheless, he says, Moshe Rabeinu, he said this in Yiddish. I'll just read it because it was, he says, Moshe Rabeinu had gegraben azoyin tifkeit von the Torah. Moshe Rabeinu dug down so deep into the depth of Torah. Everson enjoys the Yiddish. He says, and therefore, afilu as a Yid vet reinfallen in alle Taivasros, so that even if a Jew would fall deep into all of the worst desires and things, in alle midosros, in the worst of all character traits, von alle shivim umos, from all the 70 nations, meaning a Jew that became like the worst of whatever culture you could have, right? And sometimes that happens. He says, "Zolem der Tzadik Kador arois genommen von Shol Tachtis durch dem Koyach von der Torah." He says this would give the ability for the tzaddik of the generation, meaning Moshe Rabeinu has people who step into his role in every generation, what the Zohar calls Hispashtusei de Moshe B'chol Dor. And because there's a linkage from the Torah to all the 70 languages, so therefore there's always a channel open. and the person can pull it out. Now here we have to pay attention that he was giving a very important qualification. He didn't say that a person who becomes very knowledgeable in the language and the culture of that country would have the ability to pull that deeply assimilated Jew out. That wasn't the qualification he gave. I will say in parentheses, they say that Rabbi Yisrael Salanter very much tried to the different countries he went to. And he went from Lithuania, he was in Germany, he was in Russia for a while, he was in France. He always tried to learn the language, right? Because he felt that would be a very useful tool in connecting with people. And it is. But nonetheless, what he's saying is the qualification for someone who can use this channel of the 70 languages is someone who is dug deep in Torah. If a person has absorbed Torah, has become Torah, then he has access to those channels. And then, even if his mastery of the language isn't so good, he can reach people. I've seen that in history. Many times there were rabbis sometimes in America who really, really tried to master a very high-level English. And they gave sermons with many multi-syllables, and it didn't do it for people. And there are others who had their European accent sometime, and their English wasn't so good. But because of who they were, they reached the hearts of people. Okay, that's the key, right? You know such people, right? So this is... somebody
smoking on Friday night.
Yeah.
And he said, he must have not realized Shabbos.
Yeah.
And that made an impression on the person who saw it.
And it's because of who the person was, right? It's interesting. They say Rebbeinu of Belz, his Yortzeit coming up soon, used to describe a Jew who didn't keep the laws of Shabbos as somebody who gets mixed up between Shabbos and Sunday. He never wanted to say anything too bad about someone. He said, no, he's mixing up Shabbos and Sunday. So this is the type of person. That's why it's very important that it was Be'er Moshe, that Moshe Rabeinu did this. He didn't set up a little faculty of language experts to translate the Torah into different languages. This was a spiritual channel that was being opened to everyone everywhere, that people who step into the shoes of Moshe Rabeinu, which in one hand is impossible, but every generation you have the leaders who have to do this and are supposed to do it, they'll be able to do that. And this is why the Sfas Emes in Baloscha says a fascinating thing as well. Chazal say, Sichas chulin shel Talmidei Chachamim tzricha limud. Okay? Many Talmidei Chachamim, right, speak about all sorts of things, right? And that's part of it. They know how to speak with people about different things. I read a story once about the Chubina Rav, who was a giant of giants. He was in Galicia, one of the greatest rabbis of Galicia. Then he was in Siberia for a few years, eventually made it here to Eretz Yisrael. And everybody viewed him as the Gadol of Gedolim. And one time he came, I forget if it was a mikveh or shul, and two guys were having an argument. And they were arguing as to whose shmektabik, that's what you call snuff in Yiddish, was better. Right? Is this one better or that one better? And finally they said, no, there's a Rav. Right? Let's ask the Rav. And they said, Rebbe, which is better, this snuff or that snuff? He says, what can I say? I have to try. I don't know what his decision was. Meaning, he was able to talk to people, to speak to people. And when you hear Talmidei Chachamim speaking, it says, tzricha limud. You have to learn from it. Now, that can have many interpretations. Number one is a lot of times you can learn from their character traits. When you see their interaction when they're shopping, you can learn a lot from them because they've absorbed Torah so much that they express it. But also, the way the Sfas Emes explains it is this. He says, Pirushat Torah yesh lo koach lahamshich hakadusha b'chol hamakomos. If there is that person who has absorbed Torah to that extent, so nothing they interact with remains what would be called secular, chulin, profane. Their kedusha ends up affecting all of those things, and therefore making them something that we can learn from, because the Torah enters it. It's that same principle of the Torah being able to enter all of those different 70 languages. It can enter every aspect of life, but again, the prerequisite is the connection, the deep connection to Torah. That's where it happens automatically. It's sichas chulin shel Talmidei Chachamim. It's something that flows naturally. Okay, in certain ways, I remember having a discussion with someone. It's, in Pirkei Avos we find that it's very important to have divrei Torah ala shulchan. That when you eat, there should be divrei Torah. And sometimes people take that very formally, right? They want to take out a sefer and read from it at every meal. There was one time I happened to observe a young couple out on a date, and the young man had a sefer and he was giving a big drasha. I don't know that, but I believe the explanation is that it's supposed to be that when Jews get together, the divrei Torah should flow naturally. It just should be a natural part of the conversation, right? And other topics will be touched on as well. But it all is affected by Torah. I'll mention that there was a young woman who spoke to me about her father, who was a very tough disciplinarian, and he made everybody sit at the table for very long Shabbos Sudas, and made them sit quietly while he gave his Divrei Torah for a very long time. And she had a very negative reaction to this. So I went with her to one of the great poskim of the generation, and he said to her, he says, that's not what it's meant to be. He says, I have my family over at my Shabbos table, children, grandchildren. He says, we speak a lot of Torah, but we speak about other things as well. He says, it's meant to be enjoyable. It's meant to be earning, it's meant to be relaxed. It's not meant to be boot camp. Now, that doesn't mean that suddenly he turns off the Torah valve and let's talk about, politics, sports, or something like that. It flows together, it flows naturally, and it gets that property of Torah in the Sichas Chumin. Okay, so this is the picture, certainly, of what Moshe Rabeinu set up for us. It shows us both, so to speak, the ability to withstand the influence of other languages. The Kotzker Rebbe said, they quoted, that when he was a child, there was a gezerah of the government, I assume the Polish government, that every child had to learn the language, and he said that he worked very hard to make sure that it wouldn't influence him. And his grandson, the Shem Shmuel, quotes that and says, you have to realize that when you are learning a language influences. The connotations, the words in a language definitely form and shape things. I was witness to a very fascinating conversation once. There was someone who came to speak to Rav Moshe Shapiro Zatzal, and he was asking him about the advisability. He wanted to write an English translation of the Nefesh HaChaim by Rav Chaim Mivolozhin. And Rav Moshe told him, he said, I don't think that that's a good idea. He says, because a book like Nefesh HaChaim, it's all about, the word he used was elokus, meaning it's a very mystical sefer about the relationship of Hashem to the universe and our souls and our relationship. He says, the words in English that would be used to describe such things all have heavy Christian connotations. And we sense that, we feel that, once Elokus would be translated as divinity. It already, you start feeling like you're in church. So these things, we have to realize the power. On the other hand, we have to realize that we have the ability to channel the Torah into those languages and to make them our tool to reach Jews anywhere and everywhere. It's an art, so we have to be both aware of the dangers, but also to be aware of the opportunity. And the key to it is, the person who can be most effective at that is not the one who's least connected to Torah, but more connected to the language and the culture. It's the person who's most connected to Torah, and then his Torah will flow through the language no matter what his vocabulary is. Again, I'm not advising that people not be able to speak eloquently. It is oftentimes a turn-off to people if they meet Ben Torah, who, when he speaks in the local language, speaks in monosyllables. Okay, that's not a great thing. But the main impact that'll go through the channel of that language depends on the person's connection. So in the future, he says this also has a picture for our future. He says, La'osid, Shia metukan hakol. In the future, when everything is fixed, there's a pasuk in Yeshayos that says, V'taron lashon ilem. The tongue of one who is mute will sing. He says, that's not just talking about someone who had a physical impairment that didn't let him speak, and then he will sing. It means that all the languages will sing to Hashem. Ki mikol ha'lashonos yemavur kavod ratzon shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. At that point, Am Yisrael will have influenced the world so that in every language there will be that clarity and expression and praise of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So that's what we're looking for and we're shooting for. And this is really the story of Am Yisrael and the nations. Right? Last week when we had the 42 journeys of Am Yisrael in the desert, so there's something which was referred to in the Nevi'im as Midbar Ha'amim, the desert of the nations. Am Yisrael has been wandering, through to speak, and I don't like that word wandering. That also has a Christian connotation. I'll just point that out. Right? You've heard the expression, the wandering Jew. Jury must know there's a plant people have in their gardens called the wandering Jew, because it just kind of grows and wanders around your garden. The connotation of wandering very much fits into the Christian narrative, that the Jews were rejected by Hashem because they didn't receive their Messiah, and therefore it was decreed that they should wander the earth. Wandering means you're not heading toward a destination. You're simply wandering in your exile and your suffering. Right? A similar word is their description of the Kotel, the Wailing Wall. Right? Why call it the Wailing Wall? Wailing is a very particular type of crying. Wailing is crying over something that is never going to come back. Their image of the Jews by the Kotel is people who are wailing for something that they had and is entirely gone. Years and years ago, there used to be an ad for Chivas Regal whiskey. It was just a picture of a broken bottle and a puddle of whiskey on the ground, and it said, "Have you ever seen a grown man cry?" Right? Another, you can't get the whiskey back in the bottle, right? Like that's what they seem to say. You can't get the Beis Hamikdash back on Har HaBayis, right? The Jews, every now and then, they come there to that place and they sit and wail. The Bechi that we talk about in the Kinnis on Tisha B'Av is very, very different. It's crying of longing towards something that will be, that is, and that we're simply far from it, right? The Navi says in Eicha, Eini yardamayim, my eyes are pouring water. Ki rochak mimeni menachem meshiv nafshi. Distant from me is that consolation that can bring my soul back. It's distant, but it's not non-existent. Right? That's the key of it. So that's just a tiny example in a couple of words how the connotations really do a lot, and we have to be aware of them. But the more aware a person is, and if your connection to Torah is so forceful, and it can manage to get the Torah's message out through those languages. So I just wanted to finish with an interesting Hasidic story about Reb Shlomo Karliner, whose yahrzeit was just last week, I believe. Yeah, Kov Beis. So this was the story. It said one Shabbos, two Talmidim of the Baal HaTanya came to spend Shabbos with Reb Shlomo Karliner. Okay, now there were different approaches in the world of Hasidus in the way they did things, right? That's also an idea. We have many, many different approaches. So v'cholak lem kavod rav, he sat them down next to him, he gave them great honor, as he should for honorable people. Now he says the way of Reb Shlomo Karliner was hatznei leches uvehester gadol. He wouldn't display his Torah knowledge. He wouldn't flash it. He wouldn't show his spiritual levels. He hid that in his behavior. Now the Baal HaTanya, if you look in his Sfarim, when he would give drashas, he would speak for hours in the deepest Torah, in the Likutei Torah, and all these things that we have. And Reb Shlomo Karliner didn't do that. It's a Rabbeinu lo shomu klum. They didn't hear anything from him. And so it was. All three suitors for Shabbos. First they thought maybe he wasn't feeling so well for one. They were waiting for the big drasha. Didn't. Va'ola b'daitam shenoig b'pashtus. And they started to think that he's a bit of a simple guy. No, he's not like the Baal HaTanya. Therefore, they didn't have any sense of submission towards him. They were almost kind of looking down on him. So Reb Shlomo Karliner sensed their feelings, and he said, come, you're called Chasidim, and Talmidei Chachamim, and Lomdei Torah. Now he says, we daven to Hashem that the Torah should teach us. He said, let's learn something from the Torah. Yosef HaTzadik made a Suda with his brothers. Okay, it says that he sat them down, and they ate and drank together. Now, Chazal said in the Medrash that this took place on Shabbos, because Yosef said, Tevoach tevach v'hochein, and prepare. The word v'hochein is a code word for a Shabbos Suda, right? Because we prepare on Friday. So he said to the Chabad Hasidim, he said, I know that when you'll go back to your city, you'll say, Ra'aytem ish echad sha'omim alav shu tzaddik. You came and you saw a certain person that people say is a tzaddik. V'umedaber b'loshen chol b'loshonos ha'amim. Okay, now it seems that he was speaking, whether it was Russian, Ukrainian, Polish, whatever it was, he was using that when he was speaking to people. Be'etzim Shabbos Kodesh. Not just on a weekday, on Shabbos. There were some tzaddikim, even back in Europe, who only spoke Lashon HaKodesh on Shabbos. Right? They had, not even Yiddish. He says, Achtedu, he says, well, you should know that Rashi, Pirush HaLakosu b'Yosef HaTzadik, ki pi hamadaber aleichem b'Lashon HaKodesh. It says, Yosef told the brothers when he revealed himself, you see that this is my mouth speaking to you, meaning I'm speaking to you in Lashon HaKodesh. Now, he says, Tzarich lohavin heichon matzinu b'krosha diber imam b'Lashon HaKodesh. It never says in the pasuk that Yosef shifted into Lashon HaKodesh. Right? He says, I've been speaking to you in Lashon HaKodesh, but there was always an interpreter. He was always speaking Egyptian. When did it happen? He says, Kipi hamadaber aleichem mashma Lashon Ovar. He's not saying, now I'm speaking Hebrew to you. He says, I was speaking Lashon HaKodesh to you before. But it said, Ki hamelitz beinosim, there was an interpreter between them dealing with the Egyptian. Chazal say it was Menashe, his son. So he says, Omnoma emes kenu. Said Reb Shlomo Karliner, this is the true explanation. Yosef said to his brothers, didn't you see that that was my mouth speaking to you? He says, even when I was speaking in Egyptian, even when I was speaking on Shabbos, that was Lashon HaKodesh. He says, because what I was saying was imbued with Kedusha and Tahara. It was an Egyptian, but I made that Lashon HaKodesh. He says, an Egyptian wouldn't be able to speak Egyptian the way I did. That's what you should have picked up on. He says, this is what Rashi means by Lashon HaKodesh. He says, if a person has, Lashon HaKodesh means a holy tongue. He says, not referring to a language. He says, I protected my Kedusha in Egypt. That's Yosef's image, Yosef HaTzadik. I protected my Kedusha, my tongue remained Kodesh. He says, if someone has damaged their tongue by saying forbidden things, the wrong things, afilu sheyishto kol yom Shabbos. Even if he doesn't say a word all Shabbos, he says, what point is it? It doesn't anything, because a person has to be mekadesh, right, his tongue. So this is the perfect example of what we're speaking about. He was trying to teach them that someone is able to create a deep connection of Torah that will then spill over into things he says in other languages, into things he says that are not directly related to Torah. It'll be that sichas chun shel talmidei chacham shetzricha limud that we can learn from and we should learn from. And this is something, first of all, that it's important to know that exists, that Moshe Rabeinu did that for us, that we can connect to it. And every Jew can connect to it. And that's why, like the Chidush Harim said, no matter how deeply dug in a Jew has become in the most negative aspects of any culture, he can come out. The channels are open. They're there always, right? And we have to make ourselves the people who are able to influence our language as opposed to our language influencing us. Okay, sorry. Wishing everyone a wonderful week, a wonderful Shabbos. Thank you very much for coming.